It's September 1st, 1939. In the gray pre-dawn darkness, a German battleship slides silently into position in Danzig harbor. Below decks, over 200 Marines are hidden, armed and waiting. At exactly 4:45 in the morning, the ship's massive guns open fire on a small Polish military depot across the water at Westerplatte. The thunder of those guns echoes across Europe. Within hours, 1.5 million German soldiers are crossing into Poland from 3 directions at once. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany, and the world's most catastrophic conflict begins. But here's the thing. The real story of how World War II started doesn't begin on that September morning. It doesn't even begin in the 1930s. To understand what truly set the world on the path to that second catastrophic war within a single generation, you have to go back 21 years earlier, to a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in France, where the guns of the Great War finally fell silent. Because what happened in the years that followed that armistice is arguably the most important story of the 20th century.
At 11 o'clock in the morning on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 4 years of industrialized slaughter came to an end. The guns stopped. The silence that followed must have felt almost alien to men who had lived so long in the constant roar of artillery. Over 8.5 million soldiers were dead. Millions more were maimed, shattered by gas, or simply broken by what they had witnessed. The empires of Europe lay in ruins, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the Ottoman, all gone, collapsed under the weight of the war. Into this rubble stepped an American president with a plan. Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe in December 1918, promising something remarkable, a new world order built not on conquest and revenge, but on justice, self-determination, and lasting peace. His 14 points laid out a framework for a world where disputes between nations would be resolved through diplomacy, not bloodshed.
A new international body, the League of Nations, would hold it all together. The crowds who greeted Wilson in Paris treated him like a messiah. Then reality hit. France and Britain had bled for 4 years. France had suffered close to 1.4 million dead soldiers and had seen its northern industrial heartland reduced to a moonscape of shell craters and rusting wire. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau was not interested in justice. He wanted Germany crushed, stripped, and unable to ever threaten France again. Britain's David Lloyd George was caught between wanting a workable peace and satisfying a British public screaming for German blood. Wilson's idealism collided head-on with the fury of exhausted, grieving nations. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years to the day after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had lit the fuse on the whole catastrophe. Germany was not invited to negotiate. The treaty was simply presented to the German delegation as a fait accompli, a dictated peace, what Germans would bitterly call the diktat. The terms were brutal.
Germany lost 13% of its pre-war territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. The Polish corridor carved Germany in half, cutting off East Prussia from the rest of the country, while the German port of Danzig was made a free city under League of Nations supervision. Germany's army was slashed to just 100,000 men, no air force, no tanks, no submarines. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial western buffer, was demilitarized and occupied. And then came the War Guild Clause, Article 231. Germany was to accept sole and complete responsibility for starting the war. Every death, every shattered city, every widow and orphan, Germany's fault. On the back of that guilt, the Allies demanded reparations, £6.6 billion, a figure so colossal that few seriously believed Germany could ever actually pay it. German scientists were required to surrender their patents. Germany's colonies were handed to the victors. Even its merchant fleet was seized. For Germans across the political spectrum, the treaty felt like a national humiliation beyond anything they had imagined.
They had been told the armistice would be based on Wilson's fair-minded 14 points. What they got instead felt like a savage punishment. And into this wound, a dangerous myth burrowed deep. The so-called Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back legend. German generals and far-right politicians claimed the army hadn't been defeated on the battlefield at all. They had been betrayed from within, by socialists, by communists, by Jews. The soldiers had fought bravely and been knifed in the back by cowards at home. It was a lie, but it was an enormously useful lie. and it would poison German political life for the next 15 years. There was one final, fatal blow to Wilson's vision. When the American president returned home and asked the U.S. Senate to ratify the treaty and join the League of Nations, Congress said no. Republican senators feared that membership in the League would drag America into future European wars. The United States, the world's rising economic superpower, withdrew into isolationism, and the League of Nations was born without its most powerful potential member.
Without the United States, the League was essentially a club run by Britain and France, two countries that were themselves economically exhausted and deeply reluctant to take on any new military commitments. The great institution meant to keep the peace had a fatal weakness baked into it from day one. Part 2. The Weimar Crucible. The Germany that emerged from the wreckage of the war and the treaty was almost unrecognizable from the Germany that had gone in. The Kaiser was gone. The military monarchy was gone. In its place stood the Weimar Republic, Germany's first genuine democratic experiment, named for the city where the Constitutional Assembly had met. From the very beginning, the Republic was fighting for its life. In 1923, France and Belgium, accusing Germany of defaulting on its reparations payments, marched troops into the industrial Ruhr region and essentially occupied it. The German government responded by encouraging passive resistance. Workers simply stopped working. To pay the striking workers and keep the economy moving, the government did what desperate governments do. It printed money, and then it printed more, and then it printed more again.
The result was one of the most catastrophic inflations in modern history. By November 1923, a single American dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. People needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. Workers were paid twice a day and immediately sent their families to spend the wages before the money lost half its value by afternoon. The savings of the middle class, the teachers, the doctors, the small business owners, the pensioners, were wiped out entirely. A lifetime's careful saving became worthless paper overnight. In the midst of this chaos, a 34-year-old Austrian-born agitator named Adolf Hitler attempted an armed coup in Munich, trying to overthrow the Bavarian government. It failed spectacularly. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he served barely 8 months. During that time, he dictated a book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which laid out with remarkable clarity everything he intended to do if he ever came to power. Tear up the Versailles Treaty, blame Germany's humiliation on Jews and communists, rebuild the military, and conquer Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Almost nobody read it carefully. The mid-1920s brought a brief, fragile recovery. American loans flowed in under the Dawes Plan, the German economy began to stabilize, and a diplomat named Gustav Stresemann managed to improve Germany's international standing. The Weimar Republic entered what some historians call its golden years, a period of genuine cultural flowering, of expressionist art and cabaret and intellectual achievement. The Nazis were a fringe party, winning barely 2.6% of the vote in the 1928 elections. Hitler seemed like yesterday's bad news. Then, on October 29, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed. The effect on Germany was catastrophic and almost immediate. American banks, now desperate for cash, called in the loans they had extended to Germany. The money that had been propping up German industry and employment simply evaporated. Businesses collapsed, banks failed. By 1932, unemployment in Germany had reached most 6 million people, almost a third of the entire workforce. Families who had barely survived the hyperinflation of 1923 now faced destitution all over again. The psychological effect was devastating. Germans had already seen their savings wiped out once. Now they were watching democracy itself seem to fail them. The Weimar Republic's political system fractured under the strain. Coalition governments rose and fell in rapid succession, each one unable to agree on how to respond to the crisis. By 1930, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning was governing by emergency decree rather than through parliamentary consensus. Democracy in Germany was already breaking down before Hitler took a single step toward the chancellery. This was the moment Hitler had been waiting for. The Nazi Party had spent the late 1920s reorganizing, building its membership, and carefully crafting its message for different audiences, promising farmers a return to rural stability, promising workers jobs, promising the middle class the restoration of their savings and dignity, promising everyone vengeance against the humiliation of Versailles. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag with 230 seats. President Paul von Hindenburg despised Hitler. He reportedly called him that bohemian corporal. But conservative politicians around Hindenburg convinced themselves they could control the wild-haired agitator if they brought him inside the government. On January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Within weeks, the Reichstag building was burning, emergency powers had been declared, political opponents were being arrested, and Germany's democratic experiment was over. It had lasted barely 14 years. Part 3. The Strongmen Rise. While Germany was experiencing its democratic crisis, the rest of the world was watching the rise of a different kind of politics and doing very little about it. Italy had gotten there first. Benito Mussolini, a former socialist journalist turned ultra-nationalist firebrand, had watched Italy emerge from World War I feeling cheated. Italy had fought on the Allied side, lost over 600,000 soldiers, and at the Paris Peace Conference had been denied the territories along the Adriatic coast it had been promised. Mussolini channeled this rage brilliantly. He organized his followers into squadristi, the black shirts, who attacked socialist unions, terrorized political opponents, and presented themselves as the only force capable of saving Italy from communist revolution. In October 1922, Mussolini organized a march on Rome, and Italy's King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war, handed power over to him rather than risk a confrontation. Within a few years, Mussolini had dismantled Italian democracy entirely, banned opposition parties, and established himself as Il Duce, the leader. He was brutal and vain, but he was also, in the early years, undeniably effective at making trains run on time and projecting an image of Italian strength. He became an inspiration to aspiring authoritarians across Europe, including a young Austrian agitator who had reportedly tried to get Mussolini's advice on organizing his own march on Berlin back in 1922. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in October 1935 with 400,000 troops, the world had its first real test of whether the League of Nations could actually stop aggression between its own member states.
Emperor Haile Selassie made a dignified and heartbreaking personal appeal to the League in Geneva. The League condemned Italy. The League imposed economic sanctions. But those sanctions pointedly excluded oil, the one thing that would actually have crippled Italy's military. Britain and France, desperately wanting to keep Mussolini as a potential ally against Germany, refused to take the steps that would have worked. 6 months after the invasion began, Ethiopia was overrun. Italy withdrew from the League, and every dictator in Europe received the same message. The League of Nations was a paper tiger. Meanwhile, Japan had delivered exactly the same message 4 years earlier on the other side of the world. In September 1931, Japanese forces in Manchuria staged a false flag incident, blowing up a section of their own railway line and blaming it on Chinese soldiers, and used it as a pretext to seize the entire province. The League sent a commission, which eventually concluded that Japan had been wrong. Japan ignored the conclusion and simply quit the League in 1933. The Lytton Report, the Commission's findings, had taken so long that Japan had already finished its conquest by the time the world formally disapproved. Manchuria stayed Japanese. Each of these failures compounded the next. Japan kept Manchuria, Italy kept Ethiopia. The League looked weaker with every passing month. The message being absorbed by Adolf Hitler in Berlin was clear. If you moved fast, presented your aggression as defensive, and exploited the West's desperate desire to avoid another war, you could take what you wanted and face no serious consequences. Part 4. Hitler tears up the map. Hitler had been the Fogel from the moment he took power. He understood that Germany needed to rearm before it could expand, and that rearmament needed to happen before the Western powers noticed how dangerous Germany had become. In secret, in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, German officers worked on new tank designs and mobile warfare tactics. They read British theorists like Basil Littleheart and developed the concept that would eventually be called blitzkrieg, fast-moving armored units thrusting deep into enemy territory, bypassing fixed defenses, sowing chaos and collapse before the enemy could respond. In March 1935, Hitler dropped the pretense. He announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force, and declared that the German army would expand to 500,000 men. Conscription was reintroduced. Britain and France protested formally and then did essentially nothing. The following year, on March 7, 1936, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone on Germany's western border, in direct violation of both the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact.
It was, by Hitler's own later admission, the most nerve-wracking gamble of his early career. His generals were terrified. If France had marched even a single division in response, the German army would have had no choice but to pull back. France and Britain had forces more than capable of stopping it. Instead, they did nothing.
The British public largely sympathized with Germany. Many felt the Versailles Treaty had been unjust and that Germany was merely reclaiming its own backyard. The French were on the eve of a general election and refused to move without British support. Hitler's gamble paid off spectacularly. He would tell his inner circle afterward that the 48 hours after the Rhineland remilitarization were the most agonizing of his life, and that the Western response taught him that the democracies would always blink. From that moment, he accelerated. In February 1938, he turned his attention to his native Austria. Hitler had long dreamed of Anschluss, the union of all German-speaking peoples into a single Greater Germany. The Treaty of Versailles had explicitly forbidden German-Austrian unification, but Hitler cared nothing for the treaty by now. He browbeat the Austrian chancellor, threatened invasion, and on March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the border. Austria ceased to exist as an independent state. Crowds in Vienna cheered as Hitler rode through the streets. Once again, Britain and France issued protests. Once again, nothing happened.
By the summer of 1938, Hitler had his next target lined up, the Sudetenland, the heavily German-populated border region of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia in 1938 was a genuine democracy with a well-equipped army and formidable mountain fortifications along its German border. It had alliances with France. It had been willing to fight. But British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was terrified above all else of another European war. He had seen the casualty lists of the last one. He flew to Germany twice to meet Hitler personally and negotiate. On September 29th and 30th, 1938, at a conference in Munich with Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and French Premier Édouard Daladier, a deal was struck. The Sudetenland was handed to Germany. Czechoslovakia, whose representatives weren't even allowed in the room, lost its frontier fortifications, its mountain defenses, and roughly a quarter of its territory and population. Chamberlain flew back to London waving his famous piece of paper, declaring he had achieved peace with honor.
Winston Churchill, watching from the political wilderness to which his own party had consigned him, said in the House of Commons with quiet devastation, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." Churchill was almost alone in saying so. The crowds that greeted Chamberlain in London were ecstatic with relief. Nobody wanted another 1914. Part 5. The Final Steps to War. Chamberlain's piece of paper was worth almost nothing. On March 15, 1939, less than 6 months after the Munich Agreement, German troops crossed into the remaining Czech lands. The entire country was swallowed. The Czech portion became the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, incorporated into the Reich. Slovakia became a German puppet state. For the first time, Hitler had conquered territory that was not predominantly German-speaking. He had broken his own explicit promise to Chamberlain and the assembled powers of Europe. The policy of appeasement died that day in Prague. Even Chamberlain acknowledged it. Britain and France began to seriously prepare for a war they had hoped to avoid. Hitler's next demand had already been forming.
He wanted the free city of Danzig returned to German control, and he wanted an extraterritorial road and rail corridor through the Polish corridor to link East Prussia with the rest of Germany. In March 1939, Britain and France issued formal guarantees to Poland. If Germany attacked, they would declare war. On the surface, this sounded serious. In practice, the geography was almost impossible. Britain and France had no realistic way of militarily reaching Poland before German forces overwhelmed it. But it was a line drawn in the sand, and it was intended to deter Hitler. It didn't. What Hitler needed now was to ensure that the Soviet Union would stay out of a German-Polish war, or better yet, participate in carving Poland up. This required something that seemed almost unimaginable, an agreement between Adolf Hitler's Germany and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, two systems that had spent years publicly denouncing each other as existential enemies. But both men were pragmatists when it suited them. Negotiations began in secret in spring 1939. Stalin had watched the Western democracies exclude the Soviet Union from the Munich negotiations entirely. He had tried to build a collective security arrangement with Britain and France, and those talks had gone nowhere. He concluded that the Western powers were content to direct German aggression eastward toward the Soviet Union,
while they sat safely behind their defenses. So Stalin made his own calculation. On August 23, 1939, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to Moscow. He and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov sat down together in the Kremlin, while Stalin watched. Within hours, they had signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The public version simply pledged that neither country would attack the other. The secret additional protocol, hidden from the world for decades, divided Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split along a line of rivers. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania fell into the Soviet sphere. Stalin would have a free hand in Finland. The two ideological enemies had agreed to divide a continent between them. When the news reached London and Paris, it landed like a bomb. The last diplomatic barrier to a German attack on Poland had been removed.
Hitler immediately ordered his generals to proceed. On the night of August 31st, SS troops dressed in Polish uniforms staged a fake attack on a German radio station at Gliwice on the German-Polish border. A German civilian with Polish sympathies was arrested, dressed in a Polish uniform, shot, and left at the scene to make the attack look convincing. Hitler would use this fabricated provocation as his justification. At 4:45 in the morning on September 1st, 1939, the guns opened fire. The Schleswig-Holstein unleashed its heavy guns on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Luftwaffe bombers screamed over Polish cities. 1.5 million German soldiers crossed the border in 3 great columns. Hitler addressed the German parliament that morning, telling them Danzig was and is a German city. The corridor was and is German. He told them Poland had attacked first. The Poles fought with extraordinary courage. The defenders of Westerplatte, 182 soldiers armed with light weapons against German artillery, dive bombers, and naval gunfire, held out for 7 days before finally surrendering.
The Warsaw garrison, roughly 140,000 poorly armed soldiers, held off 175,000 Germans with over 1,000 artillery pieces and 1,000 aircraft, repelling multiple assaults, before the city was simply bombed into submission, with 560 tons of bombs dropped in a single day on September 25th. On September 17th, Soviet forces invaded from the east, as secretly agreed. Poland was crushed between 2 empires. On September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world's most destructive conflict had begun. Part 6. Connecting the threats. So what really started World War II? The honest answer is that it was never one thing. It was a chain of causes, each one making the next more likely, until the final catastrophe became almost inevitable. It begins with the peace that failed. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 was neither just enough to feel fair, nor harsh enough to permanently weaken Germany. It humiliated Germany without disarming it in any lasting sense, created economic grievances that festered, and gave demagogues the raw material for decades of resentment politics. The stab-in-the-back myth that grew from that humiliation corrupted German political culture at its roots. In the League of Nations, born without its most powerful potential member, was never given the tools to do its job. Then the Great Depression arrived and knocked over the already shaky table. Economic catastrophe did what resentment alone couldn't quite manage. It drove millions of desperate, frightened people toward anyone who promised simple answers to complicated problems. Hitler offered the simplest answers of all. Blame the Jews, blame the communists, blame the November criminals, tear up the treaty, restore German greatness. When people are terrified and hungry, rational argument struggles against the seductive fury of someone who tells them their suffering is someone else's fault. The rise of Mussolini in Italy demonstrated that democracy could be dismantled using democracy's own tools, and that the Western powers would accommodate an authoritarian if he seemed preferable to communism. Japan showed that an aggressive power could simply defy the League and face no serious military consequences. Ethiopia confirmed it.
Spain showed that Hitler and Mussolini would intervene abroad without hesitation, testing weapons and tactics in a real war, while the democracies looked away and called it non-intervention. Then came appeasement, not merely as cowardice, though it contained cowardice, but as a genuine miscalculation. Chamberlain and Daladier were not stupid men. They were men traumatized by the memory of the last war, governing nations that were economically and militarily underprepared, making desperate gambles in the hope that one more concession would satisfy an appetite that had no intention of being satisfied. The lesson of Munich was not just that appeasement failed, it was that every concession made Hitler more confident, more reckless, and less willing to believe that Britain and France would ever actually fight. And finally, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact removed the last restraint. With the Soviet Union standing aside and secretly participating in the carving up of Poland, Hitler had no eastern threat to worry about. He could strike west and east in sequence. The pact didn't just enable the invasion of Poland, it made it a certainty.
21 years separated the armistice of 1918 from the guns of 1939. A French marshal, Ferdinand Foch, looked at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and said it was not a peace treaty, but rather an armistice for 20 years. He was right almost to the month. What he understood, and what the peacemakers in Paris either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge, was that a settlement built on humiliation rather than genuine reconciliation would plant the seeds of the next conflict in the very act of ending the first one. History is rarely the story of a single villain or a single mistake. It's the story of failures compounding across decades, of small decisions and large ones, of human fear and human pride and human miscalculation accumulating into catastrophes that could not have been predicted with perfect certainty, but could, with wisdom and courage, have been prevented at a dozen different points along the way. That's what really started World War II.
And that's what makes it one of the most important stories anyone can study. Because the chain of cause and effect that runs from the guns of 1918 to the guns of 1939 has lessons that reach far beyond that particular century, that particular war, that particular generation of young men who paid the final price for it all. If you found this video valuable, please consider hitting the like button. It genuinely helps other people find this channel. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden history of the Second World War, go ahead and subscribe. There are many more stories to tell, and we are just getting started.